The rain doesn't fall in Queen Anne, it haunts. It clings to the Victorian gables and slicks the cobblestones like a shroud, turning the streetlights into blurred, weeping eyes. From my window, the Seattle skyline is nothing but a gray ghost, drifting in the mist. Inside, the air is too thin, scrubbed raw by the scent of lemon bleach and the clinical stillness Julian demands. This house is a cathedral of glass and silence, and I am its only parishioner. I began with his briefcase, a habit of service I've performed for 30 years. It sat on the marble island, a slab of expensive Italian leather that always smelled of mahogany and success. But today, as I reached for it, a different scent cut through the sterile hygiene of my kitchen. It was faint, buried beneath his $300 cologne, the cloying, metallic tang of stagnant water and something organic, something sour. It was the smell of a cellar left closed for too long. The smell of decay. My fingers trembled as I unzipped the side pocket to clear out the usual debris of a high-powered life. I expected receipts for dry cleaning or perhaps a stray cufflink. Instead, a single sheet of heavy bond paper slid out. The header was embossed with the logo of a private clinic in Switzerland, the ink so black it looked wet. Infectious disease panel. Comprehensive diagnostic summary. I felt a cold prickle of sweat bloom along my spine. My vision tunneled, focusing on the forensic details of the page. It wasn't just a document, it was a map of a secret life. At the top, Julian's full name was typed in a font that felt as sharp as a scalpel. Below it, a grid of results, rows of abbreviations followed by the word reactive in bold, unapologetic type. My eyes darted to the bottom of the page, to the date. 3 months ago. While we were celebrating our anniversary in Maui. While he was kissing my forehead and telling me I was getting forgetful, because I couldn't remember where I'd put the mail he had actually hidden. The rain lashed against the kitchen window, 1,000 tiny fingers tapping, trying to get in. I stared at the clinical symbols on the page, the biological markers of a betrayal so deep it had turned his very blood into a weapon. He had sat across from me every night, sipping vintage Bordeaux, knowing he was carrying a rot that he'd eventually pass to me, or perhaps already had. The doormat. Clara would have tucked this away and waited for him to explain it, to let him weave another web of beautiful lies. But as the smell of that hidden decay rose from the leather, something in the basement of my soul finally snapped. The silence of the house wasn't peaceful anymore. It was the silence of a grave. The heavy oak door groaned, a sound Julian usually masked with his smooth, practiced gait, but today he moved with a terrifying precision. He didn't even drop his coat. He simply stood in the archway of the kitchen, his silk tie perfectly knotted, his hair silvered and immobile. He looked like a man carved from marble, except for the eyes. His eyes were focused on the white paper trembling in my hand. "Clara," he said. His voice was a low, melodic hum, the kind he used to soothe boardrooms. "You're touching things that don't belong to you again. I thought we discussed your wandering mind." "Julian, this report," I whispered, my voice cracking like dry parchment. "The infectious disease panel. It says, reactive. It says you've been. It says you are unwell, Clara." He didn't raise his voice. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, pressurized canister, a medical-grade disinfectant he kept in the car. "You've breached the perimeter. You've contaminated the sanctuary." Before I could recoil, he depressed the nozzle. A fine, freezing mist erupted, coating my face and the document. The chemical scent was violent, a sharp, stinging vapor that burned my nostrils and made my eyes water. It tasted of ammonia and bitter salt. I gasped, dropping the paper. It fluttered to the marble floor, now spotted with damp, translucent circles like translucent sores. "Strip," he commanded. He stepped forward, the heels of his bespoke Oxfords clicking against the tile. "You're covered in it. The filth of your curiosity. You're a biohazard in my kitchen, Clara. Look at you. Shaking. Pathetic. This is why I have to manage the details. You can't even handle a simple piece of discarded correspondence without falling apart." He sprayed again, this time aiming for my throat, the cold mist settling into the creases of my skin. The sting was rhythmic, a physical manifestation of the shame he'd fed me for decades. I felt the wetness seep into my silk blouse, turning the fabric heavy and cold against my chest. He wasn't looking at me like a husband looks at a wife. He was looking at a spill on a countertop that needed to be eradicated. "Everything you touch turns to a mess," he sighed, his tone shifting to a mock-tender disappointment that hurt worse than the chemicals. Go to the laundry room. Take it all off. Put yourself in the wash on high heat. I'll be up shortly to see if you've managed to scrub away the delusion, or if I need to call Dr. Eris about adjusting your dosage again. I stood there, dripping, the smell of bleach masking the rot I now knew lived inside him. I was a ghost in my own home, a creature of porcelain being hosed down by its maker. As I turned to obey, my eyes caught my reflection in the darkened window, a wet, shivering shadow. But beneath the stinging spray, a new sensation was beginning to itch. It wasn't the chemical. It was the first, faint heat of a fire I had thought he'd extinguished years ago. The sunroom used to be my sanctuary, a glass jewel box overlooking the sound where I could watch the fog roll in over the water. Now, it is a laboratory. Julian spent the morning draped in a silence more suffocating than the humidity, transforming the space into a quarantine zone. He moved with the rhythmic, terrifying grace of a surgeon, taping heavy industrial plastic sheets over the French doors. The sound of the adhesive ripping, thwack-ev, thwack-ev, echoed like the tearing of skin. He tells me I am leaking anxiety, that my hysteria is a pathogen he cannot allow to infect the rest of our pristine life. I am seated on the wicker chaise, wrapped in a coarse white robe that smells of lye, watching him through the translucent film. The plastic blurs the world outside, turning the lush Seattle greenery into a smear of bruised watercolor. I am no longer a wife. I am a specimen beneath a microscope, trapped in a fishbowl of his judgment. Julian entered the room only once today, wearing blue nitrile gloves that snapped against his wrists with a sickening, playful pop. He carried the medical document I had found, the one he'd sprayed with poison. He held it with the tips of his fingers, as if my very touch had left a permanent stain on the ink. He didn't look at me. He studied the paper, his face a mask of ironed composure, his breathing steady and shallow. "The messiness of your mind, Clara," he murmured, his voice muffled by the plastic barrier he had constructed. "It's a contagion. You see a diagnostic error and you build a cathedral of lies out of it. You're lucky I'm willing to decontaminate you. Anyone else would have called the asylum by now." I watched his gloved hand smooth out a wrinkle in the paper. He treats objects with more tenderness than he treats my soul. To Julian, order is a god. Every drawer in this house is a grid, every towel is folded into a perfect, oppressive rectangle. I used to admire that precision, thinking it was the scaffolding that held our beautiful life together. Now I see it for what it is, the bars of my cage. He doesn't love me, he loves the absence of friction. He loves the way he can polish the truth until it disappears. 48 hours. The condensation from my own breath is beginning to fog the plastic sheets, trapped in here with me. I can see my daughter's face in the silver-framed photo on the side table, just outside the plastic shroud. Sophie. She has my eyes, but she has Julian's fire. He thinks he has contained me, that he has washed away my agency with a bottle of disinfectant. But as I watch him meticulously fold those blue gloves, a cold, hard clarity is crystallizing in my chest. He thinks he's the cleaner, but he's forgotten that a storm doesn't need to be tidy to wash a house away. The scent of bleach in my sunroom prison is so aggressive it begins to hallucinate memories. If I close my eyes, the acrid sting transforms into the heady, suffocating perfume of 1,000 Casablanca lilies. I am back at St. James Cathedral, draped in silver silk, watching my daughter Sophie glide down the aisle toward a life Julian had engineered with the precision of a watchmaker. He was the architect of dreams, that day. I remember the way the light caught the stained glass, casting deep rubies and sapphires across the white lace of Sophie's train. Julian stood at the head of the reception table at the Rainier Club, his glass of vintage Krug raised, the very picture of patriarchal grace. He looked at Sophie, not as a father looks at a child, I realize now, but as a curator looks at a masterpiece he has finally ensured. To the sanctity of the bloodline, he had toasted, his voice echoing against the vaulted ceilings. To protecting the lineage from the impurities of the world. A father's duty is to be the filter, the shield that ensures only the pristine survives. The applause had been deafening. I had beamed beside him, playing the role of the supportive, slightly invisible wife, convinced that his obsession with purity was just a byproduct of his deep love for us. I believed his lies because they were wrapped in velvet and gold. I didn't see the filter for what it really was, a sieve designed to catch and discard anything he couldn't control. Now, the lilies are dead. The white lace has been replaced by the crinkle of industrial plastic sheets. The protector is sitting in the next room, reading medical reports with gloved hands, hiding a contagion that could unspool Sophie's entire future. If he is carrying a reactive disease, what has he brought into our lineage? What rot has he introduced to the very bloodline he claimed to sanctify? The irony tastes like copper in my mouth. He spoke of protecting us from the world while he was the very thing we needed protection from. He is the parasite in the palace. He spent a fortune on Sophie's wedding to signal his status, but it was all just a coat of high-gloss paint over a crumbling foundation. As I sit on this sterile chaise, the memory of that toast begins to curd inside me. I look at my hands, wrinkled and smelling of disinfectant, and I think of Sophie, my vibrant, unsuspecting Sophie, who still thinks her father is a saint. The U-bend of my life has reached its lowest point. The melancholic fog is lifting, replaced by a searing, white-hot clarity. If Julian wants to talk about protecting the lineage, he's about to find out what a mother's protection actually looks like. It isn't a toast or a glass of champagne. It's a scalpel. The front door chimes, a delicate, silver sound that usually signaled the start of a curated evening. Through the hazy distortion of the plastic sheets, I see Julian's silhouette move toward the foyer. He isn't carrying a spray bottle now. He isn't snapping on nitrile gloves. He is opening the door for Arthur, his closest friend and business partner, with an easy, practiced warmth that he has denied me for 48 hours. I press my face against the cold, crinkling polyethylene, my breath hitching as I watch the two of them. There is no talk of contamination here. No clinical distancing. Julian places a hand on Arthur's shoulder, a gesture of brotherhood so casual it feels like a physical blow to my chest. They stand in the soft glow of the chandelier, two princes of industry, their polished exteriors suggesting nothing but success and hygiene. But then, Arthur tilts his head to laugh at a whispered joke, and the light hits him squarely. There, creeping up from beneath the starch of his white collar, is a jagged, angry patch of red. It isn't a simple irritation, it is a raised, textured rash, weeping slightly at the edges, looking like a burn that has refused to heal. I look back at Julian. Now that I know what to look for, I see the subtle, rhythmic way he adjusts his own French cuffs, concealing the same inflamed skin on his wrists. The infectious disease panel wasn't just a document, it was a confession for a shared sin. They lean in close, their heads nearly touching as they speak in low, urgent tones. The hypocrisy is a thick, oily film in the air. Julian treats me like a leper, a biohazard to be scrubbed out of existence, yet he stands there in the foyer, exchanging breath and touch with the very man who shares his rot. They are a closed circuit of infection, protected by their suits and their status, while I am the one locked in a cage for the crime of noticing. It's under control, Julian murmurs, his voice carrying just enough for me to catch. The clinic in Zurich sent the latest suppressants. We just need to keep the environment contained. He glances toward the sunroom, his eyes meeting mine through the plastic. His expression doesn't soften. It is the look of a man checking a seal on a hazardous waste bin. He doesn't see a wife. He sees a leak that needs to be plugged. Arthur follows his gaze, his face a mask of pitying condescension, the red patch on his neck flaring like a warning light. A cold, incandescent rage begins to boil in the pit of my stomach, dissolving the last traces of my fear. They think their wealth is a disinfectant. They think they can shroud their filth in rhinestones and marble. But the rot is already inside the house. It's on their skin, in their blood, and in the very air they breathe while they pretend to be pure. I am no longer the specimen. I am the witness. And as I watch them retreat into the library to toast their secrets with 20-year-old scotch, I realize that a storm doesn't need an invitation to break the glass. It just needs to be heavy enough. The sunroom has become a terrarium, and I am the soft thing dying inside it. Through the thick, crinkling veil of Julian's safety curtains, I watch him play the role of the grieving husband. He stands in the hall with Arthur, their voices hushed into that particular frequency of masculine pity that sounds like a funeral dirge. They aren't talking about the reactive panels or the weeping sores on their necks anymore. They are talking about me. The cognitive decline is accelerating, Julian whispers, loud enough to puncture the plastic. She's hallucinating documents now. Imagining illnesses. It's the early onset dementia we feared. She's become untidy in her mind. I press my palms against the polyethylene, wanting to scream that I am the only clear-eyed person in this house of mirrors. But the gaslighting is a heavy, gray fog. It makes me question the very marrow of my bones. Was the report real? Or did I manufacture it out of the loneliness of my 54th year? I reached for my copy of Jane Eyre on the side table, seeking the comfort of a familiar struggle, but my fingers found only empty air. Julian has removed the books. He claimed the paper fibers were harboring pathogens, but I saw the truth in his cold blue eyes. He is stripping away my vocabulary. He is turning me into the mad woman in the attic before I even have the chance to set the curtains on fire. I feel unworthy of Bronte now, a stuttering ghost who can't even hold a pen without wondering if the ink is a delusion. He has replaced my library with bottles of high pH water and sedative-laced teas that taste of copper and betrayal. It's for the best, Arthur, Julian continues, his tone a masterpiece of manufactured heartbreak. We'll have to restrict her access to the main house entirely. For her safety. To keep the environment sterile. You know how she gets when she's messy. Messy. The word is a lash. To Julian, my humanity, my grief, my suspicion, my very memory, is nothing more than a spill to be mopped up. He is constructing a narrative where my disappearance into a private facility will seem like an act of mercy to our social circle. I can see the headline he's writing in his head, The Tragic Decline of Clara Thorne. I look at the plastic sheets, the way they distort the light into jagged, ugly shapes. He thinks he has hollowed me out. He thinks that by taking my books and my dignity, he has taken my power. But in the hollowed-out spaces, something else is growing. A cold, quiet vacuum is filling with a pressure he doesn't understand. He has spent 30 years teaching me that cleanliness is godliness, but he's forgotten that the most effective way to clean a wound is to cauterize it. I am not losing my mind. I am losing my patience. And as I watch him hand Arthur a fresh glass of scotch with those trembling, diseased hands, the doormat, Clara, finally dies. The woman who remains is beginning to realize that if I am to be the monster in his story, I might as well show him how deep my teeth can go. The gravel in the driveway crunched, a sound that usually meant the return of a guest, but today it sounded like the snapping of bones. I pressed my forehead against the cold, vibrating glass of the sunroom, my breath hitching as a white SUV pulled to a stop. It was Sophie. My beautiful, brilliant Sophie, her golden hair caught in the damp Seattle wind as she stepped onto the lawn. She was carrying a bouquet of peonies, my favorite, their heavy pink heads nodding like drowsy children. I clawed at the plastic sheeting Julian had taped over the glass, the industrial adhesive screaming in protest. I wanted to howl her name, to warn her of the rot beneath the floorboards, but the house was built for silence. Through the layers of polyethylene and triple-paned glass, the world outside was a muted, undersea kingdom. Julian met her before she reached the porch. He didn't rush, he glided, the architect of dreams, moving to protect his construction. He caught her by the elbows, his back to me, but I could see Sophie's face perfectly. I saw the moment her smile faltered. I saw the bouquet of peonies slip an inch in her grip. Their voices reached me as a distorted, underwater rumble. I couldn't hear the words, but I knew the cadence. It was the rhythm of a lie. Julian leaned in, his posture a masterclass in performative heartbreak, his hand gesturing vaguely toward the sunroom where I stood trapped. He was telling her I was gone. Not dead, but worse, erased by my own mind. He was painting a picture of a psychotic break, of a mother who had become a biohazard of the soul. Sophie's eyes drifted toward the window. For a second, our gazes locked. I pressed my palms flat against the pane, a silent prayer for recognition. See me, Sophie. See the mother who raised you, not the monster he's inventing. But then, the most agonizing thing happened. Sophie didn't see a victim, she saw the mess Julian had described. She saw her mother behind a shroud of plastic, disheveled and frantic, looking every bit the mad woman he had spent weeks carefully curating. Her eyes widened with a flash of genuine, bone-deep fear. She didn't wave. She didn't move toward me. She looked away, her shoulders collapsing as she turned her face into Julian's chest for comfort. He held her then, his gloved hand stroking her hair, the protector shielding the daughter from the pathogen. The sight of his diseased wrist, hidden by the silk of his cuff, so close to her healthy, vibrant skin, ignited something in me that went beyond grief. It was a chemical reaction. The doormat, Clara, didn't just burn away, she vaporized. The shame of being seen as a monster by my own child was the final catalyst. He had stolen my home, my health, and my sanity, but I would not let him have her. He was a creature of bleach and lies, but a mother's rage is a natural disaster. As Sophie climbed back into her car, sobbing into her hands, I stopped clawing at the plastic. I stood still, my heart beating with a cold, rhythmic precision. He thinks he's contained the infection. He has no idea that the storm is finally ready to break the glass. I watch Julian through the translucent skin of my cage, and for the first time in 30 years, the god of order looks small. He is in the hallway, a silver-haired sentinel armed with a spray bottle and a microfiber cloth. He is scrubbing the wainscoting where Sophie might have brushed against it, his movements frantic and jagged. This is his tower of bleach, a monument built to keep the world out, but I see the crack in the foundation. He isn't afraid of the microbes in his blood, he is terrified of the light. He is afraid that if he stops scrubbing for a single second, the rhinestones will fall away and reveal the blackened, weeping truth of what he has become. Every few minutes, he pauses to adjust his collar, his fingers twitching toward the angry red rash he thinks I can't see. He believes his wealth is a laboratory-grade sealant that can keep his secrets airtight. He treats his betrayal like a spill, something to be neutralized, wiped clean, and forgotten. But the rot is sentient now. It's a ghost that won't be exorcised by ammonia. He approaches the plastic barrier, sliding a tray through the slit in the sheets. A porcelain bowl of broth, a silver spoon, and the small white pill that makes the world turn to gray wool. "Eat, Clara," he says, his voice a polished floor, slippery and cold. "You need to be compliant if you want to get well. You want to see Sophie again, don't you?" The mention of her name is the final spark. He uses her like a scalpel, cutting into the softest parts of me to keep me docile. I look at the tray, at the prison food, designed to keep me in a state of chemical twilight, and I feel a sudden violent surge of clarity. I am the one who kept this house. I am the one who knew the weight of every silver fork, the thread count of every sheet, and the rhythm of every heartbeat under this roof. He thinks I am the specimen, but he has forgotten that I am the one who knows where the poison is kept. I do not touch the tray. I watch him walk away, his heels clicking a hollow, arrogant beat on the marble. I lean forward and pour the broth, the warm, drugged liquid, into the soil of the potted palms. I let the white pill roll into the floor vents, a tiny marble of deceit lost in the dark. The U-bend of my life has ended. I am no longer descending into the suffocating mist of his gaslighting. I am rising. The melancholic ghost who wept behind the plastic is gone, replaced by a cold, incandescent fury that feels like iron in my veins. He wants a sterile environment? I will give him one. I will strip away the lies until there is nothing left but the bare, ugly bones of his vanity. He thinks he is the master of the house, the one who decides what is clean and what is filth. He has spent decades turning me into a doormat, but he's about to realize that a storm doesn't care about the polish on the floor. I am the rain, I am the wind, and I am coming for every glass wall he has ever built. The clock on the mantel, a gilded antique that once felt like a symbol of our shared history, chimed 2 a.m. In the driveway, the low, predatory growl of Julian's car faded into the Seattle mist. I watched the taillights bleed into the fog, two red eyes disappearing into the dark. Silence rushed back into the house, heavy and expectant. My heart was a frantic bird hammering against the cage of my ribs. Without the drugs in my system, my senses were agonizingly sharp. The smell of the adhesive tape on the plastic sheets was a chemical scream, the cold air on my skin a tactile demand for action. I didn't use a knife, I used my bare hands. I gripped the edge of the industrial polyethylene and pulled. The sound was a violent, rhythmic ripping, like the sky tearing open. I stepped through the gap, my bare feet hitting the marble floor of the hallway. It was freezing, a hard, unforgiving reality after days of sunroom confinement. I moved toward the kitchen, my breath coming in shallow gasps. My mind was a map of escape, the back mudroom, the spare key hidden in the stone urn, the long walk to the main road where I would find a phone, find a lawyer, find Sophie. I reached the heavy oak door of the kitchen, my fingers brushing the polished brass handle. It was so close, the smell of the rain, the promise of the dark. "You always were a terrible liar, Clara." The voice didn't come from outside. It came from the shadows of the breakfast nook. A lamp flickered on, casting a harsh, clinical glare across the room. Julian was sitting there, still in his overcoat, his leather gloves perfectly smooth across his knuckles. He hadn't left. The car, the engine, the departure, it had been a theater of cruelty. A test of my stability. "Look at you," he said, rising slowly. He didn't sound angry, he sounded disappointed, a tone that used to make me crumble. Escaping into the night in a thin robe, barefoot. You're proving every word I told Sophie. You are a danger to yourself, a woman lost in the labyrinth of her own broken mind. He stepped into the light, and I saw the glint of the keys in his hand. Not the car keys. The keys to the lower suite, the basement. The sunroom was a courtesy, a place of light, he murmured, his eyes tracking the way my hands shook. But you've contaminated it with your defiance. You need a more controlled environment. Somewhere the variables are fixed. Somewhere the rot can't spread. He took my arm. His grip was a vice, a surgical clamp disguised as a husband's touch. I struggled, but the adrenaline that had fueled my escape was curdling into a cold, hollow dread. He led me away from the door, away from the rain, toward the narrow stairs that led beneath the house. The basement wasn't a cellar, it was a vault. It smelled of concrete and fresh paint, a high-gloss windowless white box where the sound of the world died. As he pushed me inside and the heavy steel-reinforced door began to swing shut, I didn't cry out. I looked at the architect one last time. He thought he was locking me in a tomb to hide his secrets. He didn't realize that by dragging me into the foundations of his house, he had given me access to the very pillars I was going to tear down. The basement is a tomb of high-gloss enamel and recycled air. There are no windows here to watch the Seattle mist, only the hum of the HVAC system and the oppressive, flickering perfection of LED panels that never dim. It is a sensory desert, scrubbed of history, smelling of nothing but industrial-grade ozone and the faint, bitter ghost of a sealant that hasn't quite cured. Julian thinks he has placed me in a vacuum where my thoughts will eventually starve for lack of oxygen. But this house was built for convenience, and even a vault has its vents. I found the laundry chute behind a seamless white panel. It is a vertical throat of galvanized steel, a hollow vein that runs from the master suite down to the bowels of this sterile cage. When I press my ear against the cold metal, the house begins to speak. The steel acts as a conductor, stripping away the insulation of the floors and delivering the truth in sharp, metallic whispers. The policy is ironclad, Arthur. Julian's voice drifts down, echoing through the tube like a coin rattling in a jar. He sounds relaxed, the clink of a crystal tumbler punctuating his words. The diagnosis is the catalyst. If Clara is deemed mentally incompetent, the guardianship is total. The infectious disease narrative was a masterstroke. It keeps her isolated, keeps the lawyers at bay, and explains away any physical irregularities on our end. And the daughter? Arthur's voice is thinner, vibrating with a nervous energy. She's starting to ask about the specific clinic in Zurich. She wants to see the records. Sophie will be managed, Julian says, his tone hardening into that terrifying, clinical flatline. I've already told her the illness is degenerative. She's grieving a mother who isn't dead yet. By the time we leave the rain for the Cayman accounts, Sophie will be grateful I've secured her inheritance. We're not just cleaning the books, Arthur. We're bleaching the bloodline. We leave the rain behind in 72 hours. Once the final papers are signed by a woman who doesn't even know what day it is, we are ghosts. I pull back from the metal, my cheek cold where it pressed against the steel. Leaving the rain. They aren't just hiding a sickness, they are planning a digital arson, burning our lives for the insurance and the offshore havens, leaving me to rot in a locked room while my daughter is left to mourn a lie. The U-shaped arc of my despair has hit the bedrock. There is no more room for melancholic reflection. The doormat did not survive the descent into this white box, but the storm is finding its center. He thinks he is the master of the environment, but he has forgotten that I am the one who spent 30 years learning the secrets of this house. He has given me 72 hours to become his undoing. I don't need a key to break out of this basement. I just need to wait for the next time the chute opens to receive his soiled laundry. The basement floor is a frozen lake of white tile, and I am a shadow gliding across its surface. I move with a predator's silence, my breath held until my lungs ache, pressing my body against the cooling unit of the wine cellar. Julian is just feet away, inside the walk-in storage locker, the vault within the vault. Through the crack in the heavy door, the scent of antiseptic and something copper-sweet drifts out, cutting through the basement's ozone. I peer through the sliver of space. The architect of dreams has his sleeve rolled up, his bespoke silk jacket discarded on a plastic bin like a piece of refuse. In the harsh, overhead glare, his arm is a horror. The skin is no longer the smooth, tanned hide of a man who spends his weekends at the yacht club. It is a map of violence, mottled with yellowing bruises and a constellation of dark needle marks that trace the path of his secret decay. He is injecting himself with a shaking hand, his face contorted in a grimace that strips away every ounce of his cultivated charm. He looks like a junkie in a tuxedo, a man drowning in his own carefully curated filth. He lets out a long, ragged exhale, the syringe clattering into a biohazard bin he thinks I don't know exists. He spends a moment smoothing his hair, adjusting his silver cufflinks, rebuilding the mask of the billionaire before he steps back out. I shrink into the darkness of the alcove, my heart a drum in my ears, as he clicks the locker shut and spins the digital dial. He walks past my hiding spot, the smell of his expensive cologne now a sickening shroud over the smell of the pharmacy. Once the steel door of the basement groans shut above, the silence returns, but the air is different. It is charged. I approach the locker's keypad. He thinks I am a woman who has forgotten her own name, but a mother's memory is a vault of its own. I don't try his birthday or mine. I try 1-9-9-4. The year Sophie was born. The year he promised to protect us. The lock chirps, a small, pathetic sound of surrender, and the bolt retreats. Inside, the locker is a museum of his double life. On the top shelf, nestled between boxes of medical suppressants and vials with German labels, sits a black leather ledger. I pull it down, the weight of it solid and damning in my hands. I open it, and the rhinestones finally shatter. It isn't a book of business, it's a ledger of shadows. Column after column of offshore transfers to Zurich, payments to private investigators to track Sophie's movements, and the staggering disposal costs for the clinic that treated his, and Arthur's, shared contagion. This is the evidence of the rot behind the rhinestones. He didn't just betray our marriage, he put a price tag on our daughter's freedom. As I tuck the ledger against my chest, the last of my fear evaporates. The doormat is buried under the white tile. I am the storm now, and I have just found the center of his world. The ledger is cold in my hands, a slab of black leather that holds the weight of 20 years of theater. I sit on the floor of the vault, the LED light humming above me like a swarm of angry hornets. I open the pages, and the scent of expensive ink meets the metallic tang of the basement air. I expect to see dividends and stock options. Instead, I see the anatomy of a parasitic life. My eyes fix on a recurring entry, Project JJ, payments to a Julian Jr. at an address in the hills of Zurich. The numbers are astronomical, a steady hemorrhage of our shared wealth into a shadow life I was never meant to witness. But it is the timeline that makes the room tilt. The payments to the private Swiss clinics don't go back weeks or months. They go back 2 years. 2 years. 730 days of waking up next to him in our Egyptian cotton sheets. For 2 years, he kissed me with lips that carried a biological secret. For 2 years, he watched me sleep, his skin pressed against mine, knowing he was a vessel for a contagion he had plucked from some gutter of his own making. While I was worrying about the garden or the menu for the museum fundraiser, he was calculating the cost of my slow, quiet erasure. Then I see it, a lump sum of $900,000, moved into a trust-labeled settlement/discretionary closure. It is dated for next month. That is the price he placed on my life. $900,000 to buy the silence of the doctors, the complicity of the lawyers, and the permanent storage of the unwell wife. I wasn't his partner, I was a liability he was amortizing over a fiscal quarter. The betrayal is a physical thing, a jagged shard of glass moving through my veins. He didn't just lie, he turned our intimacy into an incubation period. He treated my body as an expendable host for his lifestyle, then had the audacity to spray me with disinfectant when I dared to notice the smell of his decay. He sat at our dinner table, toasted to our longevity, and watched me drink the wine he'd paid for with money earmarked for my own institutionalization. The doormat, Clara, would have crumbled under the weight of this horror. She would have wept for the man she thought he was. But that woman is dead, smothered by the plastic sheets of his making. As I trace the ink of his signature, the sharp, arrogant loops of a man who thinks he is untouchable, the melancholic fog in my mind burns away. In its place is a searing, incandescent heat. I am not a specimen. I am not a biohazard. I am the bookkeeper of his sins, and I've just finished the audit. He wants to talk about settlements? He has no idea what he owes me. I am going to take this ledger, this map of his filth, and I am going to use it to incinerate the architect's world until there isn't even ash left to bleach. I have no pen, so I use the only tool left to a woman erased, the dark. I find a scrap of heavy, cream-colored cardstock in a discarded box of invitations, the edges still embossed with the gold leaf of Julian's vanity. I take the silver spoon from my tray of prison food, a heavy, ornate piece of the Thorne Legacy flatware, and I use its handle to etch the truth into the paper. I don't use ink. I press the metal into the fibers with the strength of a woman who has been silent for 30 years, carving the words so deeply they become a braille of betrayal. He is sick. The ledger is in the vault. Sophie. Run. My fingers ache, the silver cold and unyielding against my palm. This is the desperate ingenuity of the damned. Julian thinks he has removed every variable, every sharp object, every means of descent, but he's forgotten that a mother's instinct is the sharpest blade in the house. I tear a strip of hem from my white robe, using it to lash the note to the neck of the spoon. The silver glints in the harsh LED light, a shimmering weight of hope and fury. I move to the laundry chute. The galvanized steel throat is a dark, vertical abyss that leads to the master suite. I can hear the house waking up above me, the rhythmic, hollow clicking of Julian's heels on the hardwood, the distant, muffled laughter of caterers setting up for the gala. They are preparing a celebration of his lies. I wait. I wait for the specific sound of the upstairs hatch opening. It is a soft, pneumatic hiss. Then, the first offering falls, a silk shirt, heavy with the scent of his cologne and the metallic musk of his secret illness. It tumbles down the shaft, a white ghost in the dark. I reach into the chute, my arms straining against the cold metal. I wedge the spoon firmly into the internal rim of the upper hatch's frame, hooking the curved handle over the edge so it dangles just inside the opening. When the next bundle of laundry is thrown in, the spoon will snag. It will fall not to the basement, but onto the bedroom floor, or perhaps directly into the hands of the maid, or better yet, Sophie, who I know is upstairs preparing for the evening's theater. I pull my arm back and close the panel. Now, the waiting game begins. I sit in the absolute dark of the corner, the hum of the HVAC system my only companion. I am a storm gathering its breath. Every second that passes is a second Julian believes he is in control, but the silver is already in the vein of the house. I listen for the scream, for the footsteps, for the sound of my daughter's realization. I have sent my truth up through the guts of this cage, and now I will wait for the foundations to tremble. The basement window is a sliver of glass at the very top of the foundation, a horizontal strip of the world choked by wet ivy and the gray Seattle drizzle. I am standing on a plastic crate, my fingers gripping the concrete ledge, when a shadow suddenly eclipses the dim light. A face appears, not the polished porcelain mask of a socialite, but the weathered, honest face of Mrs. Gable. Julian had fired her 3 months ago, claiming she was unsanitary after 20 years of keeping our home. He'd humiliated her, accusing her of stealing silver while she wept on the driveway, but I see now that he simply couldn't have an old soul with keen eyes witnessing his transformation into a monster. She looks at me through the glass, her expression a mixture of pity and a shared, ancient female understanding. She doesn't speak, the risk is too great. Instead, she presses a small, rectangular object against the pane. It is a burner phone, wrapped in a plastic sandwich bag to protect it from the rain. She slides it through the narrow ventilation gap she must have pried open from the outside, her fingers trembling as she drops it into my waiting palms. With a sharp nod and a whispered "for Sophie," she vanishes back into the fog, a ghost haunting the man who tried to erase her. I drop to the floor, my heart thundering. I power on the device, the blue light of the screen blinding in the white vault. There are no names in the contact list, only initials. But the messages are the physical manifestation of the rot. The airport suite is secured, one read, sent from Julian's primary number to a contact labeled A. Arthur has the suppressants. We need to finalize the transfer before the symptoms become impossible to mask. The hotel staff is paid for their discretion. No records, no traces. The threads of the shared interests began to unravel in my hands. It wasn't just business. Julian and Arthur hadn't just shared offshore accounts, they had shared a secret life of predatory indulgence in sterile hotel rooms near the runway, a cycle of filth they had brought home to our beds. The texts detailed transactions for young companions and the subsequent, panicked medical consults when the first lesions appeared. They spoke of me as an obstacle, and of Sophie as leverage. The realization is a physical blow to my stomach. He wasn't just a narcissist, he was a biohazard in a bespoke suit. He and Arthur had been maintaining a clean perimeter while wallowing in a mire of their own making, using the airport hotel as a sanctuary for their depravity. The U-shaped arc of my descent has reached its end. There is no more room for the quiet, melancholic wife who wondered what she did wrong. The burner phone is the final piece of the furnace. I look at the messages, the cold, calculated way they discussed leaving the rain, while leaving me to die in it, and I feel the doormat, Clara, finally incinerate. I am the storm now. I have his ledger, I have his texts, and I have the righteous, incandescent rage of a mother who has just seen the wolf at her daughter's door. The steel door to my white-walled purgatory didn't creak. It sighed, a hiss of pressurized air that signaled a breach in Julian's perfect vacuum. I expected the shadow of my captor, but instead, the light from the hallway framed Sophie. She stood there, trembling, her gala gown a shimmer of midnight blue that looked like a bruise against the clinical white of the basement. In her hand, she clutched the silver spoon and the etched cardstock I had sent up the chute, my message from the underworld. Mom! Her voice was a fragile thread, thin and frayed. She looked at me, and I saw the war behind her eyes. She was looking for the messy, delusional woman her father had described, the mother who had supposedly lost her grip on reality. But I stood tall, my shoulders squared, the robe of my confinement suddenly feeling like a general's cloak. Look at me, Sophie, I said, my voice resonating with a gravelly strength I hadn't felt in decades. Don't look at the plastic or the bleach. Look at the cage he built for me. Does this look like a hospital? Or does it look like a disposal unit? She stepped closer, her eyes darting to the heavy industrial lock on the outside of the door. The fear that had clouded her gaze on the lawn began to evaporate, replaced by a cold, sharp realization. The architect had overplayed his hand. His house was too perfect, his hygiene too violent. Sophie saw the red, weeping rash on her own thumb where she had held her father's hand earlier, and her breath hitched. He said you were dangerous, she whispered, her lip quivering. He said you were infected with a darkness. The infection is in the vault, Sophie. And it's in him. I reached into the shadows of the locker and pulled out the black leather ledger and the burner phone Mrs. Gable had risked everything to deliver. I shoved them through the narrow gap of the door, the heavy weight of the truth passing from my hand to hers. Open it to the last page. Look at the trust funds. Look at the airport hotel receipts. Look at what he cost us to keep his rhinestones shiny. She flipped the pages, her eyes scanning the columns of betrayal. I watched the moment her childhood died. I watched the architect's daughter become my daughter. Her face hardened, the soft lines of her grief sharpening into a jagged incandescent rage that mirrored my own. Above us, the heavy thud of Julian's footsteps echoed, the master of the house returning to check his specimens. He was coming to finalize the erasure. He's coming, I hissed, my hand gripping her arm through the doorframe. Take those. Go to the library. Plug that phone into the house media server. Let the guests see the purity he's so proud of. I am not the mad woman in the attic, Sophie. I am the storm that's going to wash this house clean. Go. She didn't hesitate. She tucked the ledger against her chest, her eyes meeting mine with a fierce, silent vow of protection. As she vanished back into the shadows of the hallway, I pulled the door shut and waited for the protector to arrive. The U-bend was complete. I was no longer at the bottom of the arc. I was the apex of the strike. I didn't wait for him to unlock the door. I threw my weight against the steel until the latch, weakened by Sophie's frantic exit, gave way with a scream of tortured metal. I stepped out of the basement's white glare and into the dim, velvet shadows of the lower hallway. My bare feet felt the vibration of the house, the muffled jazz, the tinkle of crystal, the polite laughter of 100 guests 3 floors above who had no idea they were sipping champagne in a gilded morgue. Julian was there, halfway down the stairs, with Arthur hovering behind him like a loyal, diseased shadow. They both froze. In the low light, the architect looked diminished. His silver hair was perfectly coiffed, his tuxedo sharp enough to cut, but his eyes were wide with a primal, cornered fear. Clara, he said, his voice a practiced balm of condescension. You've breached the quarantine. You're confused. The medicine. The medicine is a lie, Julian. Just like the dry cleaning receipts and the late nights at the office. I advanced on him. I didn't rush. I moved with the slow, inevitable pressure of a rising tide. For every step I took forward, he took a half step back, his hand gripping the mahogany banister until his knuckles turned white. Arthur, ever the coward, retreated into the shadows of the alcove, his hand instinctively twitching to cover the weeping red patch on his neck. I held up the burner phone Mrs. Gable had smuggled to me. Its screen was a bright, neon accusation in the dark. I found your shared interests, Julian. I found the airport suites. I found the invoices for the silence of the girls you broke and the doctors you bribed. You're hysterical, he spat, though his voice lacked its usual iron. He tried to reclaim the space, stepping toward me with a finger pointed like a scalpel. I was protecting the family. I was filtering the filth so it wouldn't reach you or Sophie. Everything I did to keep our world pristine. Pristine. I laughed, a sharp, jagged sound that echoed off the marble walls. Look at your wrists, Julian. Look at Arthur's throat. You aren't a filter. You're a reservoir. You've spent 30 years convincing me I was the one who was messy and unstable, while you were the one leaking rot into our daughter's inheritance. I stepped into his personal space, the scent of his expensive cologne now failing to mask the sour, medicinal tang of his secret. He flinched. The doormat was gone. The woman standing before him was a storm he couldn't contain with bleach or plastic sheets. He isn't protecting us, Arthur, I said, casting a glance at the trembling man in the shadows. He's burying us. He's liquidating the accounts and preparing a cage for me so he can walk away from the wreckage he created. But the rain is coming inside tonight. I moved past them, heading for the stairs to the ballroom. I could feel the heat of my own rage, a righteous, incandescent energy that made the air shimmer. Julian reached for my arm, his gloved hand trembling, but I shook him off with a strength that sent him stumbling against the wall. The architect had lost his blueprint. I wasn't just leaving the basement, I was tearing down the house. I burst into the sunroom like a fever breaking. The gala guests stood frozen in the hallway beyond, their faces pale cameos of shock as the house's integrated media system began to scream my truth. On every high-definition screen in the ballroom, Julian's secret life was a digital hemorrhage. The text messages, the ledger entries, the clinical reports of his shared filth with Arthur. The architect of dreams stood in the doorway, his mouth agape, his curated world dissolving into a puddle of neon light and public ruin. Sophie was already there. She didn't look like a victim, she looked like my daughter. She held the heavy, industrial-grade plastic sheeting in her hands, her knuckles white. With a guttural cry of pure maternal reclamation, she wrenched the shroud from the French doors. The sound of the adhesive failing was a thunderclap, a violent liberation. She tore the sterile cage to ribbons, the polyethylene falling to the floor like the molted skin of a snake. "Get out, Dad," Sophie said, her voice a cold, sharp blade. Julian tried to step forward, his hands raised in a pathetic gesture of negotiation. "Sophie, sweetheart, your mother is. My mother is the only person in this house who isn't a lie." I walked to the center of the room, toward the massive baccarat crystal vase that sat on the mahogany pedestal, Julian's favorite trophy from a merger 10 years ago. It was filled with white lilies, those flowers of death and purity. I didn't hesitate. I swept my arm across the wood. The crystal hit the marble floor with a sound that felt like the shattering of my own chains. Water and glass and bruised petals exploded in every direction, a chaotic, beautiful mess that no amount of bleach could ever fix. I turned to Julian. He looked smaller than I ever thought possible. Without the silence of the house to protect him, he was no titan. He was a paperman, a hollow shell held together by starch and narcissism. The red rash on his neck seemed to glow under the sunroom lights, a brand of his own making. Beside him, Arthur had completely wilted, his face a gray mask of impending litigation and social death. "You spent 30 years trying to wash me away," I said, stepping over the shards of crystal toward him. My voice was no longer a whisper, it was the wind before the flood. "You called me messy. You called me weak. But I am the storm that finally cleaned this house, Julian. And you are the filth I'm scrubbing out." I didn't wait for him to respond. I didn't need his excuses. I signaled to the security team, men he had hired to protect his secrets, who were now staring at the screens with disgust. "Escort Mr. Thorne and his partner from the property. They are no longer part of the inventory." As they were dragged toward the rainy night, Julian's bespoke shoes squeaked against the wet marble, a pathetic, rhythmic whimpering. I stood with Sophie, my arm around her shoulders, watching the architect vanish into the Seattle fog. The plastic was gone. The glass was broken. The air was finally, beautifully, undeniably foul with the scent of the real world. I breathed it in, deep, jagged and free, The house is different when the lies are gone. The silence no longer feels like a held breath, it feels like a clearing. Julian is a ghost now, a memory of a parasite purged from the system. I watched his car disappear into the Queen and mist, the tail lights fading like embers in a gutter, and for the first time in 30 years, I didn't feel the need to reach for the bleach. The air in the foyer is heavy with the scent of wet earth and the sharp, honest ozone of the storm, and it is the most beautiful thing I have ever smelled. Sophie and I sat in the kitchen, the marble island no longer a surgical table for Julian's briefcase, but a place of gathering. I took a glass, not a plastic tumbler, but a heavy, cut crystal tumbler that caught the light in 1,000 jagged prisms. I filled it with water straight from the tap. We shared it, the cold liquid tasting of minerals and reality, a baptism for the life we were reclaiming. There were no pills in the water. No copper tang of betrayal. Just the simple, bracing truth of being alive. "What now, Mom?" Sophie asked. Her voice was steady, the tremors of her father's influence washed away. She looked at the decimated sunroom, at the ribbons of plastic still clinging to the doorframes like the shed skin of a monster. "Now," I said, and my voice felt like iron, "we change the locks. We open every window. We let the rain in until the scent of him is nothing but a footnote." I walked to the window and pressed my hand against the glass. The rain was no longer a haunting presence, no longer the ghosts trying to get in. It was a deluge of clarity. It lashed against the Victorian gables, scrubbing the soot from the stones and the rot from the foundations. It was a cleansing fire made of water. In the distance, the Seattle skyline began to shift. The thick, suffocating fog that had acted as Julian's accomplice was finally retreating, pulled back by the wind. The Space Needle emerged from the gray shroud, its needle-thin spire piercing the clouds, standing sharp and silver against the dark. It looked like a sentinel, or perhaps a spear. We began to talk, not in whispers, not in the coded language of the oppressed, but in the bold, messy vernacular of the free. We spoke of lawyers and bank accounts, of the house we would sell and the life we would build on ground that wasn't poisoned by a narcissist's vanity. Julian had spent a lifetime trying to keep us pristine, but as I watched the clean rain wash the last of the lilies down the driveway, I realized that I didn't want to be pristine. I wanted to be whole. The storm had passed through us, and while it had shattered the glass and torn the rhinestones from the walls, it had left the foundation standing. I am no longer the doormat. I am the woman who survived the architect. And as the clouds finally parted over the sound, I knew that the next time it rained, I wouldn't hide. I would stand on the porch, my head held high, and let the water take whatever was left of the ghosts.